一个幽灵，共产主义的幽灵，在欧洲徘徊。
I'm in Washington, D.C., and I am at the National Air and Space Museum. This museum has like the best aviation collection in the world. When you first walk in, you enter the Milestones of Flight Hall with some very historic aircrafts, a Soviet and US nuclear missile, hopefully disarmed because this building's right by the US Capitol. This lunar module was built in the 1960s for testing. A replica of Sputnik, which was the Soviets' first satellite in space. The Gemini 4 command module. Edward Wright became the first American to walk in space using this capsule. This is Freedom 7, in which Astro Senator John Glenn in 1962 became the first American to orbit the Earth. I also saw this 2 years ago at the JFK Library in Boston. I got to touch a moon rock piece. This isn't a real spaceship, but it's a piece of film history. This is the studio model for the Starship Enterprise in the original 1960s Star Trek TV series. It was in the opening credits and in transition scenes. That is Chuck Yeager's Bell X-1, the glamorous Glennis, the first plane to travel faster than the speed of sound in 1947, in which he flew over 700 miles per hour. Pretty amazing. Inside this replica of the facade of the second Wright cycle shop is the exhibit on the Wright brothers. Despite conspiracies that say otherwise, Wilbur and Orville Wright of Dayton, Ohio did invent the airplane. They were printers. That is from their print shop, which I have been to. And this is some of their type. And they owned a bicycle shop in Dayton. This is one of their bicycles. And they did their flight research and testing in their spare time. Also, that's Orville's mandolin. And this thing just blows me away. That is the 1903 Wright Flyer. This was the airplane used by the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina on December 17th, 1903, and it totally changed the world. This was the first heavier-than-air machine to fly controlled by man. Orville flew the first successful flight. It reached a distance of 120 feet in 12 seconds. In the fourth and last test of that day, Wilbur flew 852 feet in 59 seconds. The fabric on there is not original, that's why it doesn't look super old, but the frame and the machinery on it is original. That's some of the original fabric. A lot of it has been turned into mementos and can be found around the world. An original propeller. Wind did overturn the plane after the fourth flight, which damaged this propeller. This is part of a launching dolly they used in 1909. Later on, the Wright brothers got involved with the Army to develop military aviation technology. This flag was flown on their first attempts, which crash got the passenger killed and Orville severely injured, and that is a propeller fragment from that. After the Wright brothers, the airplane industry did fairly quickly begin to grow in the 19-teens and 20s for commercial and military use. This is Chauncey Spencer's flight jacket and gear. In 1939, he completed a flight from Chicago to New York to DC to promote racial equality in aviation. This is the Douglas World Cruiser named the Chicago, and in 1924, this plane became the first to circumnavigate the globe by air. It took 175 days, making 74 stops and covering about 27,550 miles. And another true piece of history, Amelia Earhart's Lockheed 5B Vega. In 1932, she became the first female to fly across the Atlantic non-stop in this plane, and also the first woman to fly across the country in this plane. Of course, she later attempted in 1937 to be the first to fly around the world, but mysteriously disappeared on that journey. This is Amelia Earhart's flight coat and goggles. This is a radio receiver she used on her 1935 solo flight from Hawaii to California. She won many accolades, some here, and that was her trophy box. This Curtiss R3C2 was used by Jimmy Doolittle, who would later lead the famed Doolittle Raid in World War II. He won a prestigious seaplane race in this plane, then set a world speed record with it the next day. In this plane, John McReady and Oakley Kelly made the first non-stop transcontinental flight in 1929 from Long Island to San Diego. This Lockheed Model 8 Sirius was owned by Charles and Ann Morrow Lindbergh, who bought it in 1929. And this is the Spirit of St. Louis, in which Charles Lindbergh completed the first solo non-stop transatlantic flight in history from Long Island to Paris on May 21st, 1927. This flight changed aviation and turned him into an international celebrity. Afterwards on this plane, he did a Pan-American tour in Central and South America. Later on, his baby got kidnapped, and he became a Nazi sympathizer. A Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. Now onto the Great War, the most wide-scale war in world history at the time, but also the first war to make use of aircraft for military purposes. Overall, it wasn't as important as most people think aviation was in World War I. The most famous legacy of World War I aviation is the Red Baron. This is a French night bomber, the Voisin 8. This exemplifies a trench in the Western Front. This is a Royal Aircraft Factory FE-8 replica. This was a rotary engine powered plane first produced in 1915 by the British. That is a German Albatross. This is a scene of a German aircraft factory in 1918 when Germany was producing unprecedented numbers of aircraft. A Fokker D-7. The pilot of this accidentally landed in a US airfield instead of a German one. A Zeppelin stock in R-4, which was a giant night raider, so it's one of the earliest bombers. This shows a British Royal Air Force home defense airfield. Some were attacked by German bombers. Now on to World War II aviation, when things really began advancing and aviation warfare became critical. This is a Supermarine Spitfire. These planes defended England against the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. Royal Air Force uniforms. A C-202 Fulgor, which was the best Italian fighter plane. A P-51 Mustang, which was considered the best World War II fighter because of its speed, range, firepower, and maneuverability. A Messerschmitt Bf-109. The Nazis used these heavily in their invasion of the Soviet Union, starting in 1941. And these were also used in most air encounters over Europe. The Japanese Mitsubishi Zero Fighter, one of Japan's best and most common fighters. Aircraft turrets of World War II. General Henry Hap Arnold's uniform from World War II. He was the commanding general of the Army Air Forces. And these are uniforms of Soviet, Nazi, and US Air Forces in World War II. Now into the Sea Air Operations exhibit on board the USS Smithsonian, an F-4F Wildcat. These were not the best, but held the line against the Japanese right after Pearl Harbor. This is a more recent aircraft, a Douglas A-4C Skyhawk. These were used in Vietnam. A Boeing F-4B-4, produced in the 1930s. A replica of the USS Pennsylvania, on which a plane first landed on a ship in 1911. A miniature USS Enterprise, the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. This is apparently what it's like on the deck of an aircraft carrier. And a Douglas SB Dauntless. These destroyed 4 Japanese carriers during the Battle of Midway. Here are some drones. Now onto the history of early commercial flight. This is the first Boeing 247D, and the 247 was the world's first modern airliner. This plane entered service in 1933 with United Airlines. This is a captain's uniform and flight attendant's uniform from the 1960s. The front of a Boeing 747. You can go inside a piece of a Douglas DC-7. This was built in 1953, and these were the first American Airlines planes to fly the New York to Los Angeles route. And you can see how flying in the 50s looks a lot more comfortable than today. There's a mini Hindenburg, oof. Back in time to the early days of flight, this is based on the Smithsonian Aeronautical Exhibition of 1913. Some early engines. Air races quickly became popular, and here are some old trophies. The Blériot 9, based off one of Louis Blériot's planes. He first crossed the English Channel. This was manufactured in 1914. This is pretty awesome. The 1909 Wright military flyer that was successful at Fort Myer, unlike the test from the previous year, and the Army purchased it for $30,000 to begin flight training in the Army, which would eventually evolve into the world's most powerful Air Force. A Curtiss D3 headless pusher. Glenn Curtiss was one of the earliest manufacturers, and in 1911 he began to focus on the military aspects, so this is one of his military designs. A pre-Wright Brothers glider, built and tested by Otto Lilienthal between 1891 and 1896. On to the space aspect of the museum. This is the Hubble Space Telescope. It's actually a full-scale mock-up made in 1975 by Lockheed Martin to conduct studies. The Apollo 11 command module, which first landed on the moon with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, was not here this visit. It's been on tour, so that kinda sucked. An early Soviet satellite after Sputnik. The Soyuz TM-10 spacecraft, in which Gennady Manikov and Gennady Strekalov returned to Earth in 1990 after a 4-month stay on Space Station Mir. Gambit 1 was a Soviet satellite first made in 1963. The Soviet Union launched this all-mass manned spacecraft in 1983 as part of an experimental program to examine the use of cosmonauts to spy from space. This is the spacesuit worn on the moon by David Scott on the Apollo 15 mission in 1971. This is a Soviet cosmonaut spacesuit. This shows a Soviet spacewalk. Also, did you know that the first man to do a spacewalk in space was the first man to die in space? The first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, wore this pressure suit during training in 1961. John Glenn wore the spacesuit when he became the first American to orbit the Earth in Freedom 7. The V-2, which was the Germans' largest and most complex missile. This was the world's first ballistic missile. Another aspect of the space race was developing the biggest and most deadly nuclear missiles. Here are some of the results. This is the Skylab Orbital Workshop, the largest component of America's first space station. Turns out this is just a backup facility though, so it wasn't flown in space, but the Skylab crews lived in here and did most of their scientific research in here. Explore the Universe has lots of historical astronomical tools, like these astrolabes and an Islamic celestial globe from the 1600s. A portable mural quadrant replica, which measured the position of stars. A really cool armillary sphere, which was used to study the celestial coordinate system. Replica of Galileo's optic tube. You can't really see it, but that's William Herschel's 20-foot telescope from the 1770s. One of the original telescopes from the historic Mount Wilson Observatory in Los Angeles. A replica Wilkinson microwave anisotropy probe. That is the Hubble Space Telescope's backup mirror. A massive space shuttle propulsion thing up close. That is the new fireproof pressure suit worn by astronauts in launch and landing after Challenger. Not sure with Columbia that it worked. I want to go to space so bad. This was used in training for astronauts to mess with Hubble's electric nerve system. And that's a Robonaut. A replica Apollo command module. Moon soil collected by the Apollo 17 astronauts. Apollo 17 breccia, which is meteorite impact rock on the moon. Moon basalt from Apollo 15. And orthosite from Apollo 16. This is Gene Cernan's spacesuit. He wore this when he was the last man on the moon so far, and that was back in 1972. This lunar roving vehicle was used on the moon. Some delicious space food. And this is Able the Space Monkey, one of the 2 original monkeys flown in space. Able flew with Miss Baker on May 28, 1959 in an experiment to test the biomedical effects of space. Able reached 300 miles above the Earth and both monkeys landed safely. Unfortunately, Able died of anesthesia during a routine post-flight operation. And from what I understand, this is Able's skin. His bones are at the National Museum of Health and Medicine. This camera was used on Apollo 7 for the first televised broadcast from space. An Apollo command module guidance and navigation station. The Apollo command module instrument panel and main display console. That looks really complicated. Apollo hydrogen oxygen fuel cells. A radioisotope thermoelectric generator. Sorry, I have no idea what these things actually do. A giant F1 engine. These are used in the initial launch. Now this is an exhibit not on planes or spacecraft, but time and navigation instruments like this 1770s dividing engine, replicas of Galileo sea clocks, famed aviation pioneer Wiley Post, who is also Will Rogers' death pilot, flew around the world in this plane in 8 days, setting a record at the time. This is an exhibit on aerial and space observation of the Earth. This is a de Havilland DH-4. This was the main type of plane used by the Postal Service after World War I. The Lockheed U-2C was an important reconnaissance aircraft used during the Cold War. That is a 1970s meteorological satellite. And one last look at the milestones of flight. Freaking amazing. Alright, that museum, definitely one of the best collections of aviation stuff. But anyways, if you like this, I have other videos on Smithsonian museums, videos here in Washington, D.C., as well as the Udvar Hazy Center. I have 2 videos there. That's the other Air and Space Museum. But anyways, thanks for watching.